The girl in the bright pink dress saw what everyone else missed. 3 men who didn't belong pretending they did. Sky had learned to read rooms the way other children read picture books, a survival skill developed in waiting rooms and bus stations where her mother worked double shifts. Tonight, the Bellecourt Museum glittered with champagne and diamonds, but something felt wrong in a way she couldn't name yet. Constantino Di Carlo entered through the main doors at exactly 7:30, snowflakes melting on the shoulders of his black coat before attendants whisked it away. The crowd's energy shifted subtly, conversations continuing, but bodies angling to track his movement through the gallery. He represented old money and older power, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew. Louise scrubbed the service hallway floors with industrial cleaner that made her eyes water and her hands crack in the dry winter air. 4 double shifts this week meant rent plus the emergency deposit after the pipes burst, flooding their apartment and 2 others. The neighbor who usually watched Sky had left for Philadelphia yesterday, leaving Louise with an impossible choice she'd solved by begging the event coordinator for special permission. The coordinator had stared at Louise for 17 seconds, her pen tapping against the clipboard in a rhythm that matched Louise's anxious heartbeat. Sky stood perfectly still during the evaluation, her pink dress, her absolute best and only nice outfit, bright against the museum's cream-colored walls. Permission came with strict conditions: invisible, silent, completely out of sight of the guests who'd paid $5,000 per ticket for tonight's exclusive viewing. Sky had kept her promise for 43 minutes, sitting cross-legged near the coat check with crayons and paper from her backpack. But the sounds from the main gallery called to her like music, violins and laughter, and the whisper of silk. She stood slowly, checking that her mother remained focused on scrubbing, then moved toward the light. The exhibition hall stretched 3 stories high, Renaissance paintings climbing walls toward a domed ceiling painted with clouds and angels. Sky had seen art in library books, but never anything that seemed to breathe like this, where candlelight made shadows dance across centuries-old canvas. She stopped before a painting of a child holding a white dove, the bird so realistic she expected to see its chest move with breath. Constantino stood near a bronze sculpture discussing commercial properties with a German investor, whose family owned half of Munich's historic district. The conversation required only partial attention, terms he'd negotiated a dozen times, numbers that shifted predictably within acceptable ranges. His real focus tracked the room's dynamics, reading power structures and alliances and who stood close to whom, and who carefully maintained distance. The first man Sky noticed wore a waiter's uniform, but held his serving tray wrong, supporting it with his right hand instead of his left. Her mother had explained once that professional servers used their dominant hand for pouring, keeping the tray balanced with the other. This man gripped the tray like it was heavy when it only held empty glasses, his knuckles white with tension that didn't match his casual expression. Snow fell heavier outside the windows, New York transforming into the winter wonderland the tourism posters promised but rarely delivered this early in December. Guests commented on the timing, how perfect for the Christmas season, completely unaware that weather conditions were currently complicating exit strategies for men who'd planned this operation during clear conditions. The rival family's intelligence had been thorough, but not thorough enough to account for an unexpected storm. Sky moved along the gallery's edge where shadows pooled between spotlights, small enough that adult eyes skimmed past her toward more important things. The second man stood near the emergency exit wearing a security uniform that looked almost right, but missed small details. Real guards had radios clipped to their left shoulders. His was on the right, and the coiled wire disappeared into his jacket at the wrong angle. Louise finished the service hallway and moved to the secondary gallery where fewer guests wandered, allowing her to work quickly through spaces that needed only light maintenance. She checked her phone, 8:47 p.m., and calculated hours remaining before she could collect Sky and escape into the snowy night. The apartment would be cold, because she'd turned the heat down to save money, but they'd bundle under blankets, and Sky would describe everything she'd seen tonight, with the enthusiasm that made poverty feel less crushing. The third man was hardest to spot because he'd positioned himself perfectly, standing among a cluster of European guests whose accents and expensive watches marked them as legitimate attendees. But Sky noticed how his eyes never stayed on the artwork, instead tracking movement patterns and calculating distances. He touched his ear twice like adjusting an earpiece, coordinating with people Sky couldn't see but knew existed, because patterns required completion. Constantino accepted champagne from a passing waiter, not the nervous one Sky had noticed, and turned toward the exhibition's centerpiece. a newly restored Caravaggio that museums worldwide had competed viciously to display first. The painting depicted Judith beheading Holofernes, violence rendered so realistically that viewers instinctively stepped back. Appropriate choice for tonight, though none of the culture enthusiasts sipping wine understood the irony. The girl's bright pink dress caught his peripheral vision, a splash of color that didn't belong among the blacks and silvers and deep jewel tones. Constantino's security training identified anomalies automatically. Wrong colors, wrong positions, wrong behavioral patterns. A child at this event qualified as all three, though she seemed harmless enough, staring at paintings with genuine wonder that most adults had forgotten how to access. Sky saw the pattern complete itself when the fake waiter adjusted his trajectory, and the fake guard shifted position near the exit. The third man touched his ear again, and something in his expression changed from waiting to ready. Math, her first-grade teacher, praised her for suddenly applied to terrible purpose. 3 points creating a triangle with one man standing at its center, unaware that geometry was about to turn lethal. The museum's heating system created subtle air currents that carried sound unpredictably, which was why Constantino heard the soft click of a safety being released despite the ambient noise. 40 years of survival instinct screamed danger before his conscious mind identified the source, every muscle tensing for movement he hadn't yet decided on. The German investor continued talking about property values, oblivious to the shift in attention. Sky didn't think or plan or consider consequences beyond the immediate certainty that the man in the expensive suit was about to die if she didn't act. She moved fast, closing the distance between them in seconds, her small hand grabbing his jacket with surprising strength. Her voice came out steady, despite her racing heart, loud enough for him to hear but quiet enough not to carry beyond their immediate space. "Don't move. He'll shoot me first." 5 words delivered with absolute conviction by a 6-year-old who understood that adults hesitated before hurting children in ways they never hesitated before hurting each other. Constantino froze instantly, his body responding to the genuine terror in her voice before his brain processed the warning's full implications. The room continued its elegant dance around them, champagne and conversation and classical music, while 2 people stood perfectly still at the center of collapsing violence. Constantino's mind processed information in the 3 seconds he remained frozen. Combat training overlaying civilian environment with tactical analysis. The child's hand trembled against his jacket, but her grip stayed firm, her body positioned slightly in front of his, in a way that blocked clear shots from at least 2 angles. She wasn't looking at him but past him, tracking something or someone with the focused attention predators recognized in prey that had learned survival. The fake waiter moved first, his trajectory adjusting as the situation deviated from planned parameters, bringing him closer to the sculpture grouping where Constantino stood. His right hand remained on the tray, but his left had disappeared beneath the white serving cloth in a way that professional servers never positioned themselves. Constantino tracked the movement without turning his head, peripheral vision cataloging threats while maintaining the frozen stillness Sky's warning had demanded. "Nobody breathe." His voice carried authority that made nearby guests pause mid-conversation, without understanding why they obeyed. Some instinct recognizing command from a man whose word meant life or death, in contexts they'd never have to imagine. The German investor's champagne glass stopped halfway to his mouth, suspended in air while confusion fought comprehension. Silence spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Sky's breathing came quick and shallow but controlled, her 6-year-old body managing fear better than adults 3 times her age would have managed. She'd seen violence before, not like this, but enough to know its shape, its smell, the particular tension that preceded action. Her mother's various jobs had exposed her to situations where reading danger meant safety, where knowing when to hide or run or freeze determined outcomes. The fake security guard near the emergency exit reached for his radio with his left hand, the wrong hand, confirming what Sky had noticed earlier. Real guards used their dominant hand for communication, while keeping their weapon hand-free, a detail this man had missed in whatever brief training preceded tonight's operation. His eyes met the fake waiters across 30 feet of crowded gallery, a glance that communicated question without words. Constantino's actual security detail registered the frozen tableau from their positions at the gallery's perimeter, reading their principal's body language for instruction. Marcus, the head of personal protection, had worked for the DiCarlo family for 11 years, and could interpret Constantino's stillness as clearly as spoken orders. His hand moved to his concealed weapon, while his eyes scanned for threats that weren't immediately visible, but obviously existed. The third man among the European guests made his mistake by moving when everyone else had stopped, his instinct to abort overriding the discipline required for successful extraction. 3 steps toward the nearest exit marked him as clearly as if he'd worn a sign announcing hostile intent. Marcus's gaze locked onto the movement, recognition spreading through the security network in silent communication that required no radio confirmation. Snow continued falling outside, each flake catching light from the chandeliers before disappearing into the darkness beyond the windows. The storm had intensified in the past 20 minutes, accumulation visible on the street below where limousines waited for passengers who wouldn't be leaving on the schedule they'd anticipated. Weather complicated everything. Getaway routes, backup plans, the basic logistics that separated successful operations from disasters. Skye felt the man behind her, the one in the expensive suit whose name she didn't know, begin to understand what she'd already figured out. His breathing changed rhythm, becoming controlled and deliberate, his body shifting balance in tiny increments that prepared for explosive movement. She tightened her grip on his jacket, a reminder that her warning remained active, that moving meant dying for one or both of them. The fake waiter's left hand emerged from beneath the serving cloth empty, his decision made by factors Skye couldn't see but could guess. Maybe the child's presence disrupted his certainty. Maybe the security personnel's sudden alertness suggested compromise. Maybe the snow outside meant getaway vehicles couldn't position as planned. Whatever calculation he'd made resulted in retreat instead of commitment, his trajectory shifting away from Constantino toward the service entrance. Louise emerged from the secondary gallery with her cleaning cart, completely unaware of the tension that had transformed the main exhibition hall into a frozen battlefield. She'd heard Constantino's command, but interpreted it as some wealthy person's dramatic pronouncement, the kind of eccentric behavior rich people indulged in at events like this. Her eyes scanned for Skye automatically, the constant low-level anxiety of a mother whose child existed somewhere outside her immediate control. The moment Louise spotted the bright pink dress pressed against an expensively suited man, maternal panic overrode every other consideration, including job security and appropriate behavior. She abandoned her cleaning cart and moved through the crowd with singular focus, her exhausted body finding energy reserves that existed only for protecting her daughter. The crowd parted without quite knowing why, some instinct recognizing a mother's determination as force that couldn't be redirected. Constantino's security detail moved simultaneously, Marcus coordinating silent instructions that positioned personnel at every exit while maintaining civilian appearances. The fake guard near the emergency door found his path blocked by 2 men whose suits fit too well to conceal weapons, but whose positioning made departure impossible without confrontation. His hand dropped away from the radio as he recalculated odds that had shifted dramatically in 30 seconds. The third man among the European guests made it 4 steps toward the exit, before real security intercepted him with the polite firmness museums used for guests who touched artwork or photographed restricted pieces. His protests in accented English sounded authentic enough that nearby attendees assumed simple misunderstanding, unaware they were witnessing an assassination's collapse in real time. The fake waiter had already disappeared through the service entrance, vanishing into the kitchen areas where staff moved too quickly to track individual faces. Skye released Constantino's jacket when she saw her mother approaching, relief and guilt flooding through her in equal measures, because she'd broken her promise to stay invisible, but had possibly prevented something terrible. Louise reached them breathing hard, her hands automatically checking Skye for injury, even as her eyes lifted to the man whose expensive suit and dangerous reputation she recognized from photographs in newspapers she read during her 15-minute lunch breaks. "I'm so sorry, sir. She wasn't supposed to..." Louise's apology died when Constantino raised one hand in a gesture that commanded silence, as effectively as his earlier words had frozen the room. His dark eyes remained on Skye, studying the small girl who'd just saved his life with an intensity that made Louise's protective instincts scream warnings about men who looked at children like they were puzzles requiring solutions. Constantino crouched slowly, bringing himself level with Skye's face, his movement controlled and deliberate in a way that suggested violence was always an option, but not currently the choice. Up close, the child's eyes showed intelligence that had nothing to do with schooling and everything to do with survival, the kind of awareness wealthy children never developed, because safety insulated them from necessity. She met his gaze without flinching, waiting for questions she knew would come. "What did you see?" 3 words that acknowledged she'd observed something worth reporting, treating her as reliable witness instead of confused child. Skye glanced at her mother for permission. a habit ingrained by a lifetime of being told children should be seen and not heard. Louise nodded despite not understanding what was happening, trusting her daughter's judgment in ways that mothers who'd never struggled couldn't comprehend. Sky's explanation came in clear sentences that demonstrated observation skills most adults never developed, describing the waiter's incorrect hand placement and the security guard's backwards radio and the third man's eyes that never looked at art. Constantino listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, but his respect for the small girl growing with each precisely recalled detail. Marcus moved closer, recording the information while simultaneously updating threat assessments based on a 6-year-old's testimony that proved more reliable than most professional intelligence. The museum's director appeared with the anxiety of someone whose exclusive event had become a security incident, his bow tie slightly askew and his forehead gleaming with perspiration. He'd been briefed by actual security that something had happened, but not what, leaving him trapped between demanding answers and fearing them. Constantino dismissed him with a look that communicated this conversation existed above the director's authority level, returning focus to the child who'd proven more valuable than expensive surveillance systems. Louise wanted to grab Sky and run, maternal instinct screaming that proximity to men like Constantino de Carlo meant danger regardless of current circumstances. But her daughter seemed calm, almost comfortable, answering questions with the seriousness of someone who understood information had weight and consequences. The disconnect between Louise's fear and Sky's composure created cognitive dissonance that made the moment feel surreal, like watching events through glass that distorted normal cause and effect. The fake security guard was being escorted to a private room by actual security personnel, whose polite efficiency masked absolute certainty about his upcoming interrogation. He'd surrendered without resistance once the exits became blocked, calculating that cooperation offered better survival odds than confrontation. The third man among European guests was experiencing similar escort toward similar destination, his protests about diplomatic immunity falling on ears that had heard every excuse wealth and power could manufacture. Sky's hands had stopped trembling, though adrenaline still made her feel floaty and disconnected from her body, the way she felt after spinning too fast on playground equipment. She'd done something important, possibly saved someone's life, but couldn't fully process the magnitude because 6-year-old brains weren't designed for understanding assassination attempts. What she understood clearly was that the man crouching in front of her radiated the same dangerous calm her mother showed when protecting Sky from drunk men at the diner, or aggressive landlords demanding rent. Constantino studied Louise with the same intensity he'd given her daughter, cataloging details that told stories about lives lived far from his experience. Her uniform hung slightly loose, suggesting weight loss from stress or insufficient food or both, and her hands showed chemical burns from harsh cleaning products. The wedding ring was absent, no tan line, no indentation, meaning single mother rather than divorce, which implied different struggles and different strengths. Marcus received confirmation through his earpiece that the service entrance pursuit had failed, the fake waiter disappearing into snowy streets where tracking became impossible without resources they couldn't deploy without attracting police attention. One successful interdiction from 3 attempts qualified as partial failure in Constantino's operational assessment, though the prevented assassination itself counted as victory. The girl's intervention had disrupted timing enough that backup plans failed before fully implementing, chaos defeating precision in ways that made professional operations collapse. The real question occupying Constantino's analytical mind was how a child had recognized threat patterns his own security initially missed. What combination of intelligence and necessity had trained observation skills that exceeded professionals? Sky had identified anomalies in seconds that should have required training and experience, suggesting either exceptional natural ability or exposure to situations where reading danger meant survival. Both possibilities interested him for different reasons. Louise's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably the event coordinator demanding explanation for abandoned cleaning cart and disrupted service flow. She ignored it because leaving Sky alone with this man felt impossible, despite his apparent appreciation for her daughter's intervention. The other cleaning staff whispered from safe distances, their expressions mixing curiosity with the satisfaction of watching Louise, who'd always seemed slightly better, slightly more educated than her position suggested, face consequences for breaking rules. The museum's ambient temperature felt wrong to Sky, too warm after the fear-induced adrenaline faded, making her bright pink dress stick uncomfortably against her back. She wanted her mother's arms, and their cold apartment, and the familiar safety of struggling together, wanted distance from men whose eyes calculated values she couldn't name. But the man in the expensive suit continued asking questions in a voice that suggested her answers mattered, treating her like people rarely treated children. Constantino's phone vibrated with messages from associates who'd witnessed the frozen moment and wanted explanation, their texts ranging from concern to thinly veiled curiosity about why the head of New York's oldest crime family had taken orders from a child. He ignored them all, focus remaining on the unlikely savior whose pink dress and sweet face disguised a survival instinct that rivaled his own. The disconnect between appearance and capability fascinated him in ways that had nothing to do with business. The German investor had relocated to the bar area where he was consuming scotch with the dedication of someone processing shock through alcohol, his commercial real estate discussion forgotten in favor of survival celebration. Other guests had resumed conversations, but the energy remained off, everyone aware something significant had occurred without understanding specifics. Security personnel maintained positions that looked casual, but created controlled perimeters, ensuring the detained men remained isolated from potential accomplices. Marcus approached with tablet displaying security footage from multiple angles, showing the fake waiter's positioning, and the fake guard's movement patterns, and the third man's coordinated timing. The video confirmed everything Skye had reported with accuracy that made her testimony courtroom-ready despite her age. Constantino watched the footage twice, noting the 17-second window between the girl's warning and the abort decision, calculating how close death had approached before a child's courage redirected fate. Louise's supervisor appeared with the righteous anger of middle management protecting territory, demanding explanation for abandoned duties and violated protocols about keeping Skye invisible. Her voice carried across the gallery with volume that suggested authority she didn't actually possess, attracting attention from guests who'd begun relaxing into renewed celebration. Louise's face flushed with humiliation that had nothing to do with the legitimate complaints, and everything to do with public diminishment in front of people whose wealth made her struggles invisible. Constantino stood slowly, his full height and presence transforming the interaction before he spoke a word, the supervisor's tirade dying as recognition replaced indignation. Power didn't require announcement when everyone already knew who held it. When reputation preceded entrance and lingered after departure, his expression remained neutral, but something in his stillness communicated that this conversation was ending on his terms, regardless of employment hierarchies or event protocols. She stays with me. 3 words that weren't request or suggestion, but statement of fact that redefined every social contract currently operating in the museum's suddenly silent gallery. Louise's supervisor opened her mouth to protest before survival instinct overrode employment authority, her brain recognizing battles that couldn't be won regardless of being right. She retreated with whatever dignity remained, already calculating how to frame this in reports that wouldn't cost her own position. Skye looked up at her mother with eyes that asked permission and offered reassurance simultaneously, a complexity of communication that mothers and daughters developed through necessity when words felt dangerous or insufficient. Louise wanted to refuse, to grab her child and run toward their small apartment and the safety of anonymity. But something in Constantino's expression suggested refusing wasn't actually an option being offered, that circumstances had shifted beyond her control the moment Skye grabbed his jacket and whispered her warning. The snow outside had transformed New York into a postcard scene that bore no resemblance to the reality of walking home through freezing streets, because subway fare competed with grocery money. Guests were beginning to request their coats, the event's magic broken by whatever had happened that nobody would explain, but everyone would speculate about tomorrow. Constantino's own coat appeared carried by an attendant who'd learned to anticipate his needs, black cashmere that cost more than Louise earned in 3 months. The detention room smelled of old coffee and anxiety, located 2 floors below the exhibition hall in what had once been artifact storage before the museum's expansion. Marcus conducted the interrogation with surgical precision, his questions calibrated to extract information, while the detained man's fear remained fresh and useful. The fake security guard had maintained silence for exactly 14 minutes before self-preservation overrode whatever loyalty the Castellano family had purchased with threats and cash. Constantino watched through one-way glass while reviewing building schematics on his phone, identifying every vulnerability the rival family had exploited during months of planning. The operation's sophistication suggested inside information. Someone had provided staff schedules, delivery patterns, the specific blind spots created by historical architecture that modern security struggled to cover. That betrayal would require identification and response once immediate threats were neutralized, a reckoning that would come quietly, but absolutely. Skye sat in a leather chair 3 sizes too large, her legs dangling without reaching the floor, her bright pink dress vivid against dark wood paneling. Louise stood nearby with rigid posture that communicated expectation of consequences, her hands clasped to hide their trembling from chemical burns and fear. The museum director's commandeered office felt stuffy despite December cold outside, heating systems working overtime to combat the winter pressing against old windows. The director himself paced the hallway with mounting agitation, his phone ringing constantly with board members demanding explanations he couldn't provide without making everything worse. Society reporters sensed scandal behind the early departures, their inquiries becoming more specific as rumors spread through social networks faster than official statements could contain. His carefully planned event had transformed into a security incident that threatened his position and the museum's reputation simultaneously. Vincent Caruso, the fake guard's real name, began providing details once Marcus made cooperation seem like his only survivable option. Each admission purchasing implied promises about what wouldn't happen. The Castellano family had recruited him 6 months ago when gambling debts exceeded his ability to pay, and desperation made betrayal seem rational. His hands shook when describing the planning meetings, the maps of the museum, the specific instructions about timing and positioning. The fake waiter was professional talent imported from Philadelphia, someone without local connections who could vanish completely after the job finished successfully or otherwise. Vincent didn't know his real name, had met him only twice before tonight, remembered mostly his cold efficiency and complete lack of hesitation when discussing murder. The third man was Castellano family directly, Anthony Castellano's nephew, whose presence demonstrated how seriously they'd taken this opportunity to eliminate their primary competition. Marcus's questions shifted toward strategic intelligence, identifying who had planned the operation, and how deeply the Castellanos had penetrated DeCarlo's security protocols. Vincent's answers came faster now, fear overriding whatever loyalty money had purchased, naming names and describing conversations that would require verification, but felt authentic. The inside source was someone in event staffing, someone who'd provided schedules and access codes, and the museum's security response procedures. Skye's attention drifted to the office's bookshelves, where leather-bound catalogs documented decades of acquisitions and exhibitions, their spines embossed with gold lettering she couldn't quite read. Her adrenaline had faded, leaving behind exhaustion that made her eyes heavy, despite the surreal circumstances keeping her awake. She wanted her mother's lap and their apartment, and the familiar comfort of struggling together in ways she understood, not this strange new territory where danger wore expensive suits. Louise checked her phone and saw 17 missed calls from the event coordinator, each voicemail presumably escalating in urgency and anger about abandoned duties. Her employment tonight was certainly finished, possibly her reputation among the staffing agencies that provided sporadic income between diner shifts. The calculation of lost wages competed with relief that Skye was safe, that whatever had almost happened had been prevented by her daughter's courage and perception. Constantino returned to the office carrying 2 bottles of water and a pastry wrapped in cloth napkin, offerings that seemed incongruous from a man whose reputation involved violence and territory disputes. He handed the pastry to Skye without asking if she was hungry, simply placing it within her reach the way someone familiar with children understood their needs. The gesture surprised Louise because monsters weren't supposed to notice small kindnesses or remember that 6-year-olds needed feeding. The pastry was some complicated French thing with layers of chocolate and cream, far fancier than anything Skye had tasted before, and eating it felt wrong somehow given the evening's events. But hunger overrode propriety. She'd eaten nothing since the peanut butter sandwich at 3 o'clock, and the sweetness grounded her in physical sensation that made the surreal situation feel slightly more manageable. Constantino watched her eat with an expression Louise couldn't interpret, something softer than the dangerous calculation he'd shown earlier. Marcus entered with tablet displaying interrogation results, his face showing satisfaction that suggested productive information extraction despite methods Louise didn't want to imagine. He spoke in Italian, rapid sentences that excluded her deliberately, reporting findings to Constantino, who listened without visible reaction. The language barrier emphasized Louise's outsider status, reminded her that she existed in their world only temporarily and at their sufferance. Constantino's response in English felt like deliberate inclusion, a choice to let Louise hear decisions that affected her daughter who'd become entangled in family business through accident and courage. The museum would receive generous donation for tonight's disruption, enough that the director's job security would improve, rather than deteriorate from the incident. Additional security would be positioned outside until the Castellano situation reached resolution, protection that extended to everyone present during the attempted hit. The implication that Louise and Sky might need protection crashed through her exhausted mind like ice water, crystallizing the reality that saving someone's life created connections and consequences beyond the immediate moment. Men like Constantino De Carlo didn't forget debts or allow loose ends, and her daughter had become both simultaneously. Louise's instinct screamed to refuse whatever he might offer, to grab Sky and disappear into New York's anonymous masses, where poverty provided camouflage. But Sky was watching Constantino with curiosity rather than fear, her child's instinct reading him differently than Louise's protective paranoia suggested she should. The girl who'd learned to identify danger in waiters' hand positions and security guards' radio placements somehow didn't register threat from the man whose business involved violence as fundamental operating principle. That disconnect terrified Louise more than the assassination attempt had, suggested her daughter saw something she'd missed, or understood dynamics that Louise's legitimate world perspective couldn't process. Constantino crouched again, bringing himself eye-level with Sky, his expensive suit jacket pulling tight across shoulders that suggested gym time or physical labor despite wealth that made such effort optional. His next words were directed to the child but meant for her mother, an acknowledgement of hierarchies that Louise appreciated despite her fear. Permission being asked rather than authority simply claimed. A gesture that cost him nothing but meant everything to a woman whose autonomy was constantly overridden by economic necessity and social position that rendered her invisible to people with power. Your mother works very hard. Statement rather than question. Observation delivered with certainty that suggested he'd already investigated their circumstances during the 30 minutes since Sky's warning. Louise's spine stiffened at the invasion of privacy his knowledge represented, anger competing with fear about what else he might have discovered about their lives. Sky nodded solemnly, her loyalty to her mother absolute even when she didn't fully understand what working hard meant, beyond long absences and perpetual exhaustion. Constantino continued speaking directly to Sky, while Louise listened with increasing apprehension about where this conversation was heading and what obligations might be created. He explained that people who helped his family received help in return, that debts of honor mattered more than money, that her bravery tonight had earned consideration most people spent lifetimes trying to achieve. The words sounded almost gentle, despite their implication of entanglement with exactly the kind of people Louise had spent Sky's entire life trying to avoid. The offer came wrapped in politeness, but felt as inevitable as gravity. A position for Louise in his legitimate business operations, something in property management that would use her intelligence rather than destroy her body. Better apartment in a building he owned, safe neighborhood with good schools, the kind of stability that single mothers dreamed about during double shifts that never quite covered rent. Everything Louise wanted and couldn't achieve through legitimate means, offered by someone whose legitimacy was performance rather than reality. Sky's eyes went wide with hope that stabbed through Louise's heart, because her daughter understood enough to recognize rescue when it appeared, even if she didn't grasp the cost. Louise wanted to refuse on principle, to maintain moral high ground that poverty made theoretical rather than practical, to protect Sky from corruption that proximity to men like Constantino represented. But principle didn't pay rent, or buy winter coats, or provide the security that let children sleep without hearing their mother cry in the next room. The drive through snowy Manhattan occurred in a black SUV with windows tinted dark enough to be illegal, and interior leather soft enough to feel like wealth personified. Marcus drove, while Constantino sat in back with Louise and Sky, the configuration suggesting protection, rather than threat, though Louise couldn't quite convince her nervous system to believe the distinction. Snow fell heavy enough that visibility dropped to single car lengths, transforming the city into abstract shapes and muffled sound that felt removed from normal reality. Sky pressed her face against the window, watching snowflakes accumulate on glass before the defroster melted them into streaks that distorted the view. She'd never been in a vehicle this nice, where climate control worked perfectly, and seats adjusted electronically, and the sound system probably cost more than every possession her mother owned. The contrast between their normal existence and this temporary luxury felt so extreme it seemed imaginary, like she'd stumbled into someone else's life by accident. Louise's phone buzzed continuously with texts from the event coordinator that evolved from angry to threatening to finally resigned. Her employment terminated via digital communication without even the courtesy of direct conversation. Losing one night's work wouldn't destroy them, but it damaged her reputation with the staffing agency, meant fewer calls for future events, reduced the already limited options available. She wanted to throw the phone through the SUV's expensive window, but instead powered it off with hands that shook from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Constantino made a call in Italian that lasted 3 minutes, his tone conveying authority that required no translation, ending the conversation with a sharp sentence that sounded like dismissal or threat. He pocketed the phone and turned attention to Louise with focus that made her acutely aware of her stained uniform and chemical-burned hands, and the vast gulf between their circumstances. His next words in English surprised her with their directness, asking about her education and work history like he was conducting a legitimate job interview rather than offering dubious rescue. Louise answered honestly because lying to men whose resources could verify everything seemed pointless and dangerous, describing the 2 years of college before money ran out and pregnancy happened. She'd studied business administration with focus on property management, had dreamed of legitimate career before reality intervened with student loans and medical bills, and a baby whose father disappeared before Sky's first birthday. The job since then had been survival rather than ambition. Waitressing, cleaning, anything that paid without requiring childcare she couldn't afford. The building where they lived appeared through the snow, 6 stories of aging brick, in a neighborhood that real estate agents called transitional, which meant poor but gentrifying slowly. Louise's apartment was 4th floor walk-up, the elevator having been broken for 8 months, despite landlord promises that repair was imminent. Constantino studied the building with expression she couldn't read, taking in details that probably confirmed everything his background check had already revealed about her economic desperation. Marcus pulled to the curb, but left the engine running, clearly not planning extended stay in a neighborhood where expensive vehicles attracted attention from people with nothing to lose. Sky had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhaustion finally claiming her despite the exciting strangeness of the evening. Louise gathered her daughter carefully, preparing to carry her up 4 flights of stairs in the building's dim stairwell, where 2 light bulbs had burned out and the super never seemed to replace them. Constantino's hand on her arm stopped the exit, gentle but firm, his touch the first physical contact between them beyond the earlier handshake that protocol had demanded. Louise froze, every survival instinct screaming warnings about men who touched without permission and offers that seemed too good to refuse. But his expression held no threat she could identify, just intensity that suggested whatever he was about to say mattered more than the casual words might imply. The position is real. 4 words that addressed skepticism she hadn't voiced, but he'd obviously anticipated. Assertion that the job offer was legitimate employment, rather than cover for something darker. He produced a business card from his jacket, plain white with embossed lettering that read, DeCarlo Property Management, and a phone number. Instructions to call tomorrow, to speak with someone named Maria who handled human resources, to begin a process that would seem almost normal if Louise could ignore who owned the company. The card felt heavy in Louise's hand, corporate-quality paper stock that probably cost more per sheet than she spent on groceries weekly, tangible proof that this wasn't fever dream or elaborate joke. She wanted to refuse it, to maintain independence that poverty had already compromised beyond recognition, to protect Sky from entanglement with people whose business operated beyond legal boundaries. But the weight of unpaid bills and broken elevator and chemical burns from harsh cleaners made refusal feel like luxury she couldn't afford. Sky stirred against her shoulder, mumbling something incoherent about paintings and snow, her small body warm and trusting in ways that made Louise's chest ache with fierce protective love. Everything she did was for this child, every double shift, and swallowed pride and moral compromise, calculated against what Sky needed, versus what Louise's principles demanded. The math had never balanced, had always required choosing between bad options and worse ones, between struggling honestly and surviving through compromise. Constantino's phone buzzed with incoming call he silenced without looking, his attention remaining on Louise with focus that felt uncomfortably like being seen rather than simply looked at. He'd done this before, she realized, identified people whose circumstances made them vulnerable to offers that seemed like rescue, but created different kinds of debt. The manipulation was probably calculated, probably exploited desperation he'd helped create through business practices that kept people like her perpetually struggling. But knowing the mechanism didn't make the offer less tempting, or her situation less desperate. Your daughter is remarkable. The observation came quietly, almost private despite Marcus's presence in the driver's seat, acknowledgement that went beyond tonight's specific heroism to something larger about Sky's character and capability. Louise's automatic response was defensive. Don't look at my child. Don't evaluate her potential. Don't see her as anything except off-limits. But Constantino's tone held respect rather than calculation, genuine appreciation for qualities that poverty couldn't diminish despite its best efforts to crush everything beautiful and hopeful. The snow had accumulated enough that the sidewalk disappeared under white blanket that would turn to gray slush by morning when plows finally reached this neighborhood. Louise's boots, worn thin at the soles and letting in cold that made her feet ache, would soak through during the walk from curb to building entrance. Tomorrow she'd stuff them with newspaper to dry while she wore her other pair that leaked even worse. The eternal rotation of inadequate everything that defined existence at the poverty line. Think about it. Constantino's final words before Marcus opened the door, releasing warm air into snowy night, and ending the strange interlude where worlds collided in the back seat of an expensive SUV. Louise climbed out carefully, adjusting Sky's weight against her shoulder, accepting help from Marcus, who appeared with umbrella large enough to cover them both. The gesture was probably trained courtesy rather than genuine concern, but Louise appreciated it anyway, grateful for any small kindness in a night that had exceeded her capacity for processing strangeness. The building's entrance door stuck the way it always did, requiring shoulder pressure and specific angle to overcome the warped frame that landlord kept promising to fix. Louise managed it one-handed while holding Sky, muscle memory from 6 months of this particular struggle making the motion automatic. Behind her, the SUV pulled away from the curb, expensive and dark, and impossibly foreign against her building's shabby reality, disappearing into snow that erased evidence of its presence within minutes. The stairwell smelled of cooking and mildew, and the specific mustiness that accumulated in old buildings with inadequate ventilation, familiar scent that meant home despite its unpleasantness. Louise climbed slowly, conserving energy for the 4 flights, while Sky's weight grew heavier with each step. Second floor landing where the Rodriguezes were arguing again in rapid Spanish. Third floor where Mrs. Chen's television played too loud because her hearing aid batteries had died, and replacement wouldn't come until disability check arrived next week. Fourth floor finally, their apartment door with its 3 locks that Louise had installed herself after the break-in 2 months ago, that had taken nothing because they owned nothing worth stealing. Inside was cold, because she'd turned the heat down to save money. Dark because leaving lights on wasted electricity they couldn't afford. But it was theirs, achieved through her own labor, without owing anyone anything. Independence that poverty made precious, because it was the only thing she controlled completely. Louise laid Sky on their shared bed, the apartment's only bedroom, which Sky used while Louise slept on the couch in the main room, and covered her daughter with every blanket they owned against the cold that would deepen before morning. The business card was still in her hand, corporate weight and embossed letters, promising escape from exactly this kind of cold and struggle and desperate calculation. She placed it on the chipped nightstand, where she'd see it tomorrow, when reality returned and impossible decisions demanded actual choices instead of theoretical principles. Morning arrived gray and bitterly cold, sunlight struggling through clouds that promised more snow before the day ended with typical December cruelty. Louise woke on the couch with neck pain from sleeping at wrong angle, her body cataloging new aches that joined the permanent collection from years of physical labor. The apartment's radiator clanked and hissed but produced minimal heat, another item on the endless list of things that barely functioned, but couldn't quite justify the expense of repair or replacement. Sky emerged from the bedroom wearing mismatched pajamas and carrying the stuffed rabbit that had been her companion since infancy, its fur worn thin from countless washings. She climbed onto the couch without speaking, burrowing against Louise's warmth with the automatic affection of children who hadn't yet learned that physical comfort could be complicated or dangerous. For several minutes, they simply held each other while Louise's mind replayed last night's events with the surreal quality of dreams that might not have actually happened. But the business card on the nightstand proved the reality, its presence transforming their normal morning routine into something weighted with decision and consequence. Louise made oatmeal on their temperamental hot plate, while Sky talked about the paintings and the snow and the nice man who'd given her fancy pastry. The child's version of events emphasized wonder over danger, her 6-year-old perspective filtering trauma through resilience that Louise simultaneously appreciated and mourned, because children shouldn't need that kind of protective cognitive distortion. The call to Maria at DeCarlo Property Management happened at 9:15, after Louise had cycled through every rationalization for refusing the offer, and found none that survival couldn't dismantle. The woman who answered spoke with professional warmth that sounded genuine rather than performed, asking questions about experience and availability without any reference to the circumstances that had generated this interview. The normalcy felt almost insulting given how abnormal everything actually was, like pretending yesterday hadn't happened, or that normal hiring procedures applied to situations involving assassination attempts and moral compromise. An interview was scheduled for 2 o'clock at offices in Midtown, address in a building Louise recognized from passing it on subway rides to wealthier neighborhoods where she sometimes worked events. She'd need to find something to wear that didn't scream poverty. Her one good outfit was the cleaning uniform from last night, stained now and smelling of industrial chemicals. Mrs. Chen from third floor might lend something. They were similar sizes despite the 30-year age difference, though explaining why she needed interview clothes would require lies that Louise was too tired to construct convincingly. Sky returned to her coloring books while Louise showered in water that never quite got hot enough, the building's ancient plumbing struggling against winter demands. She tried to imagine working in property management, using her incomplete education in ways that felt legitimate, even if the company's ownership made legitimacy theoretical. The alternative was returning to the staffing agency diminished by last night's termination, competing for fewer opportunities with worse reputation, the slow slide toward circumstances that terrified her more than Constantino DiCarlo's dangerous world. The subway ride to Midtown cost $2.75 that Louise could barely spare. The calculation of every expense a constant background process that never fully stopped running. She wore Mrs. Chen's navy dress that fit reasonably well, despite being dated in style, carried her worn purse that she'd tried to clean without much success. Sky stayed with Mrs. Chen, who'd agreed to watch her for 3 hours in exchange for Louise helping with grocery shopping later, the informal economy of favors that sustained people whose cash flow never quite matched their survival needs. DiCarlo Property Management occupied 3 floors of a building where the lobby's marble floors gleamed with the kind of maintenance that required both money and attention to detail. Security at the entrance checked identification with professional courtesy, calling upstairs for verification before issuing visitor badge that felt heavier than plastic and lamination should weigh. The elevator was new enough that it moved silently, displaying floor numbers on digital screen that seemed unnecessary, but demonstrated the casual wealth that characterized everything about this building. Maria turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the brisk efficiency of someone whose competence had earned respect in male-dominated environment through years of proving herself indispensable. She conducted the interview in a conference room with windows overlooking Manhattan, asking substantive questions about property systems and tenant management and the kind of problem-solving that Louise's various jobs had required, even if titles hadn't reflected actual complexity. For 40 minutes it felt almost normal, almost like legitimate opportunity rather than compromise with forces she didn't fully understand. The salary offer came at the end, numbers that exceeded anything Louise had imagined possible without advanced degrees or connections she didn't possess. Health insurance was included, comprehensive coverage that would mean Sky could see dentists and doctors for preventive care rather than only emergency situations. Start date was flexible, but they'd prefer next week if possible. Eagerness that suggested genuine need rather than manufactured urgency designed to prevent careful consideration. Everything about the offer was too good, except the source, too perfect, except the implications. Louise accepted before her rational mind could construct objections that fear and principle demanded, hearing herself say yes, while internal voices screamed warnings about deals with devils and compromises that started small but expanded until integrity became unrecognizable. Maria smiled with satisfaction that seemed genuine, producing paperwork that transformed verbal offer into contractual obligation, requiring signatures and tax forms and emergency contacts. The bureaucracy of legitimacy, wrapped around fundamentally illegitimate circumstances. Performance of normalcy that everyone involved understood was partly theater. The background check would take 3 days, Maria explained. Routine procedure that everyone underwent regardless of referral source or circumstances. Louise wondered what they'd find in her history beyond poverty and struggle. Nothing criminal, certainly, but nothing impressive either except resilience that didn't translate to resume qualifications. The check felt like opportunity for reconsideration. 3 days when the company could discover she wasn't actually worth the generous offer, and withdraw with professional apologies that preserved everyone's dignity. Paperwork completed, Louise was dismissed with handshake and welcome aboard pleasantries that felt surreal given how this opportunity had originated in violence and her daughter's courage. The elevator descent happened too quickly, returning her to street level where normal people rushed past pursuing normal ambitions through normal channels. She felt displaced, caught between worlds with citizenship in neither, too compromised for legitimate society, but too naive for the dangerous one she'd just agreed to enter. The walk to the subway passed through streets where Christmas decorations created festive atmosphere that felt disconnected from Louise's internal turmoil and moral vertigo. Store windows displayed luxuries marketed to people whose December stress involved choosing perfect gifts, rather than calculating if electricity or heat deserved priority when budget couldn't cover both. She'd joined their world now, theoretically, accepted rescue that came with obligations she couldn't yet fully comprehend, but knew would eventually demand payment beyond labor hours and professional competence. Mrs. Chen returned Sky with report that the girl had been perfectly behaved, coloring quietly, and eating the soup offered for lunch without complaint or mess. Louise gathered her daughter with gratitude that extended beyond the immediate favor to the broader network of women, who helped each other survive circumstances that crushed people who faced them alone. She'd need to tell Mrs. Chen about the new job, about the move that better salary would enable, about leaving this building where they'd struggled together, but at least knew their neighbors and felt relatively safe. Sky chattered about her day while they climbed the 4 flights, her endless energy incomprehensible to Louise, whose exhaustion felt bone-deep and permanent. Inside their cold apartment, the business card still sat on the nightstand, joined now by signed contracts that made last night's offer concrete rather than theoretical. Louise had 3 days before the background check completed, and everything became official. 3 days to reconsider and retreat or accept and adapt to a future she couldn't quite envision but desperately needed. The rest of the day passed in domestic routine. Laundry in the building's basement machines, dinner from ingredients that required creativity to transform into something nutritious, bedtime rituals that brought comfort through their familiarity. But underneath normal activities ran current of change and consequence, awareness that they stood at boundary between their old life and something new that promised safety, but required trust in people whose business involved violence as fundamental operating principle. Louise lay on the couch long after Sky fell asleep, staring at ceiling cracks she'd memorized during countless sleepless nights, wondering if she'd just saved her daughter or sold her soul to protect her. The background check cleared on the 3rd day with phone call from Maria, whose voice carried satisfaction that suggested she'd anticipated the clean result, despite Louise's own doubts. Start date was Monday, 5 days away, enough time to arrange Sky's enrollment in the elementary school 3 blocks from their new apartment. The building Constantino owned, where rent would be deducted automatically from Louise's salary at rate far below market value, sat in a neighborhood where children played outside without constant supervision, and grocery stores sold fresh vegetables instead of just canned goods and lottery tickets. Louise gave notice to her current landlord, who barely acknowledged the information, already planning to raise rent for whoever took the apartment next, despite its deteriorating condition and broken elevator. Packing took less than a day because they owned so little, their possessions fitting into boxes borrowed from the corner bodega whose owner had known them for 3 years. Mrs. Chen cried when Louise explained the move, happiness for their improved circumstances, mixed with sadness about losing neighbors who'd become family through shared struggle and small kindnesses. The new apartment had 2 actual bedrooms, windows that closed properly against winter cold, and heating that worked through radiators that didn't clank like they were trying to escape their moorings. Sky ran from room to room with wonder that broke Louise's heart because her daughter's joy came from basic functionality that should have been baseline rather than luxury. The kitchen had full-sized refrigerator and stove that ignited reliably. The bathroom had water pressure that didn't fluctuate randomly between trickle and flood. Everything worked the way things were supposed to work when landlords maintained properties instead of extracting maximum profit from minimum investment. Moving day arrived with the kind of bright cold that made snow sparkle like the Christmas cards Louise could never afford to send. Temperature low enough that breath created clouds, but sun provided illusion of warmth. Marcus appeared with 2 other men whose names Louise didn't catch. Muscle hired to carry boxes up 3 flights to the new apartment because this building's elevator actually functioned. They worked with efficient silence that suggested this wasn't the first favor they'd performed for people connected to Constantino through circumstances that mixed business with something more complex. The elementary school's principal had been expecting them. Sky's enrollment processed with unusual speed that suggested phone calls had been made and influence applied. The building was newer than Louise's own elementary school had been, with computer lab and library stocked with books published within the last decade, instead of damaged cast-offs from wealthier districts. Sky's placement test showed reading level 2 grades above her age, Math skills that impressed the evaluator, who asked careful questions about enrichment opportunities Louise had never been able to provide, beyond library visits and educational television. Louise's first day at DiCarlo Property Management began with orientation that covered emergency procedures and company policies, and the organizational structure that positioned her in tenant relations with path toward property management, if performance warranted promotion. Her desk faced window overlooking street, where people rushed past pursuing their various ambitions. Her computer was new enough that programs loaded quickly. Her phone extension appeared on business cards that identified her as professional associate with font that made the title seem more impressive than entry-level position actually warranted. The work itself felt almost disappointingly normal, responding to tenant maintenance requests, coordinating with contractors, managing the databases that tracked leases and payments, and the thousand small details that kept buildings functioning. Her colleagues were professional without being particularly warm, establishing boundaries that suggested they knew who owned the company, and maintained careful neutrality toward anyone whose employment originated through personal connection rather than standard hiring channels. Louise appreciated the distance, because friendship would have required explanations she didn't want to give about how she'd earned this position. Lunch breaks she spent in the small park 2 blocks from the office, eating sandwiches from the deli that charged prices she could now almost afford, without the constant calculation that had characterized every purchase previously. Other office workers occupied the benches reading phones or books, or simply sitting in whatever sun-penetrated December clouds, their relaxation suggesting lives without the constant low-level crisis management that poverty demanded. Louise tried to imitate their casual confidence, but felt like performer in play where everyone else had received scripts she was still learning to improvise. Skye adapted to her new school with the resilience children demonstrated when change improved, rather than worsened their circumstances, making friends whose parents had addresses in neighborhoods Louise recognized as solidly middle class. The other mothers at pickup engaged in conversations about dance classes and summer camps, and educational enrichment that assumed discretionary income for activities beyond survival necessities. Louise participated cautiously, aware that her legitimacy in this world was recent and potentially fragile, that one wrong revelation about her past or Constantino's involvement could transform her from welcomed newcomer into suspicious outsider. 2 weeks into the new job, Louise encountered Constantino in the building's lobby, where he was meeting with investors whose expensive suits and European accents marked them as serious money. Their eyes met across the marble floor for perhaps 3 seconds, acknowledgement without greeting, before he returned attention to his companions, and she continued toward the elevator. The brief connection felt weighted with unspoken understanding. He'd provided opportunity, she'd accepted it, and the debt between them existed whether or not either acknowledged it directly. December deepened toward Christmas with the city, transforming through decorations and commercial enthusiasm that made poverty more visible, through contrast with abundance displayed in every storefront. Louise bought Skye actual presents instead of dollar store items wrapped to look more valuable than they were, watching her daughter's face on Christmas morning, and understanding that this, the joy without anxiety about rent or heat or food, was what she'd compromised her principles to achieve. The guilt felt manageable compared to the years of watching Skye pretend satisfaction with inadequate everything, while Louise's heart broke from inability to provide better. The office Christmas party happened in a restaurant Louise had walked past hundreds of times without imagining she'd ever enter as guest rather than service worker. Her colleagues drank wine that cost more per glass than she used to spend on weekly groceries, discussing vacation plans and renovations, and the comfortable concerns of people whose baseline security allowed focus on optimization rather than survival. Louise sipped her single glass slowly, and tried to feel like she belonged here instead of like imposter waiting for exposure. Constantino appeared near the party's end, making brief rounds that acknowledged employees without requiring extended conversation, his presence creating ripples of heightened attention wherever he moved. When he reached Louise, his greeting was professionally appropriate and completely unremarkable to anyone watching, asking how she was settling into the position with tone that could have applied to any new employee. But his eyes held question that went beyond professional courtesy, assessment of whether she regretted her choice or had made peace with the compromise it represented. "Skye is thriving," Louise answered, her response addressing what she thought he was actually asking beneath the polite surface conversation. Something in his expression shifted toward satisfaction, confirmation that his investment in their well-being was generating returns he valued, even if they couldn't be quantified in traditional business metrics. The exchange lasted perhaps 90 seconds before he moved to the next cluster of employees, but it established understanding that this arrangement was working for everyone involved, despite its unconventional origins. The Christmas market in Union Square became Saturday tradition, where Louise and Skye wandered among vendor stalls selling handcrafted items and seasonal foods, participating in holiday rituals that had always existed behind glass of economic exclusion. Skye wanted to examine everything, her natural curiosity now expressible without the constant no that poverty had required, her questions about how things were made or where they came from receiving actual answers instead of dismissal based on unaffordability. Louise bought her hot chocolate and roasted chestnuts, small luxuries that felt enormous after years of denying even the smallest indulgences. The collision happened near a stall selling wooden toys, Skye darting forward to examine carved animals while Louise fumbled with her wallet and accidentally bumped into someone whose expensive coat and familiar presence registered simultaneously. Constantino steadied her with hand on her elbow, the touch lasting only seconds but communicating solidity that went beyond preventing her fall. His own surprise seemed genuine rather than manufactured, suggesting this encounter was accident rather than orchestrated meeting, though Louise's cynicism made her question whether anything involving him could truly be coincidental. Skye's delighted recognition cut through Louise's awkward apology, the child remembering the man who'd given her fancy pastry and helped her mother find better job without understanding the darker context that complicated the kindness. She grabbed his hand with the unself-conscious affection children showed toward adults who'd proven safe, pulling him toward the toy stall to show him the carved rabbit that looked similar to her worn stuffed companion. Constantino followed without resistance, his dangerous reputation incompatible with the gentle attention he gave Skye's enthusiastic explanation. Louise watched them together and felt something shift in her understanding, recognition that people could contain contradictions without those contradictions negating each other completely. Constantino's business involved violence and territory and operations that existed beyond legal boundaries. But his treatment of her daughter showed genuine care that wasn't performance or manipulation. The cognitive dissonance was uncomfortable because simple categories, good people, bad people, were easier to navigate than complex reality, where someone could be both dangerous and kind, depending on context and relationship. He bought the carved rabbit over Louise's protests about it being unnecessary, his insistence gentle but absolute, in ways that reminded her he wasn't accustomed to having his generosity refused. Skye clutched the new toy with joy that made the $30 price tag seem insignificant, despite representing amount that would have been impossible luxury in their old life. They parted with polite goodbyes that masked the strange intimacy of their entangled circumstances, each returning to separate worlds that had briefly overlapped in the Christmas market's cheerful chaos. Walking home through streets where Christmas lights created warm glow against winter darkness, Louise acknowledged that her feelings toward Constantino had evolved beyond simple fear or gratitude into something more complicated. He'd disrupted her life's trajectory, but toward improvement rather than destruction, had offered rescue that came with obligations, but also with genuine concern for her daughter's welfare. The situation wasn't what she would have chosen if choice had existed outside theoretical construct, but it was working in ways that her previous desperate struggling had never managed to achieve. January arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made poverty lethal and comfort expensive, temperatures dropping low enough that homeless encampments became death traps and heating bills tested even middle-class budgets. Louise's new apartment maintained warmth without requiring constant adjustment of thermostats or strategic layering of blankets, small mercy that she'd stopped taking for granted because recent memory still held too many frozen mornings. Skye no longer woke with complaints about being cold, no longer needed to wear jacket indoors. Developments Louise cataloged as victories against the circumstances that had defined their previous existence. Work settled into rhythm that felt sustainable rather than constantly crisis managing, her responsibilities expanding as Maria recognized competence that exceeded what the position technically required. Louise was managing 3 properties now instead of 1, coordinating renovations and handling difficult tenants and solving problems that required both people skills and practical knowledge. The challenges engaged parts of her brain that years of survival mode functioning had suppressed, reminded her that she'd once had ambitions beyond simply making rent and keeping Skye fed. The promotion came with raise that pushed her firmly into middle-class income bracket, numbers on pay stub that still seemed unreal despite their regular appearance every 2 weeks. She opened savings account for the first time in her adult life, watching small balance grow instead of constantly depleting checking to cover emergencies that poor people experienced more frequently because everything they owned existed on edge of failure. The psychological shift from scarcity to sufficiency changed how she moved through the world, reduced the constant vigilance that poverty demanded as survival mechanism. Sky's second-grade teacher requested meeting to discuss the girl's advanced capabilities and whether acceleration might be appropriate, conversation that would have been impossible in their previous school district, where resources barely covered baseline instruction. Louise sat in the clean, well-lit classroom, listening to descriptions of her daughter's intelligence and wondering how much potential had been suppressed by circumstances beyond either of their control. The teacher recommended testing for gifted program, opportunities that came with their new address and school district, rather than being universally available to children whose only disadvantage was being born poor. Constantino appeared occasionally at the office, his visits creating subtle tension that rippled through the staff, regardless of his consistently professional demeanor. Louise had learned to distinguish between his business persona, cold, calculating, absolutely in control, and the slightly softer version he showed in personal interactions with people he'd decided to value. She fell somewhere between those categories, neither purely employee nor quite personal connection, occupying ambiguous space that both of them seemed content to leave undefined. Their conversations remained brief and ostensibly professional, exchanges about property management or tenant issues that provided legitimate cover for the checking in that seemed to be their actual purpose. He asked about Sky with genuine interest that surprised Louise every time, despite months of evidence that his concern was authentic rather than performance. She'd learned to answer honestly, sharing small victories and funny stories, while carefully avoiding anything that might sound like complaint or request for additional help beyond what he'd already provided. The flowers arrived at her desk on a Tuesday in late January without card or explanation, a dozen white roses arranged with the kind of casual elegance that signified expense and taste. Louise's colleagues noticed immediately, their speculation about secret admirer creating office gossip that made her uncomfortable despite the flowers' beauty. She knew they came from Constantino without needing confirmation, recognized the gesture as communication in the language of silence they'd developed where actions spoke what words couldn't safely express. Returning them felt impossible without creating more attention than keeping them, so Louise placed the vase on her desk where morning light made the petals seem to glow. The roses lasted 9 days, longer than she'd expected, their gradual fading seeming metaphorically significant in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. When they finally died, she disposed of them quietly, taking the vase home because it was beautiful, and she'd never owned anything quite like it before, joining this strange new world where gifts appeared without explanation, or obligation being explicitly stated. February brought Valentine's Day with its commercial insistence on romantic love, the holiday feeling particularly loaded given Louise's ambiguous relationship with the man who'd transformed her circumstances. Sky made cards at school for her classmates, her careful printing and crayon decorations, representing the kind of normal childhood activities that stable housing and adequate income enabled. Louise helped her address envelopes while trying not to think about her own lack of romantic prospects, or whether the isolation was choice or consequence of circumstances that made normal dating feel impossible. The invitation arrived via Maria, carefully framed as professional opportunity rather than personal request. Constantino was hosting dinner for key property management personnel and their families. Casual evening meant to build team cohesion. Louise recognized the fiction immediately, because her position didn't actually qualify as key personnel. Understood this was invitation extended specifically to her disguised as general business function. Declining felt impossible without insulting him. Accepting felt like acknowledging the unspoken connection that hovered between them, becoming something more defined and potentially complicated. The dinner happened at restaurant Louise had read about in magazines, the kind of place where reservations required weeks of advance planning, and menu prices weren't listed because people who belonged there didn't need to consider cost. Sky wore new dress purchased specifically for the occasion, navy blue with white collar that made her look older and impossibly dear, her excitement about fancy dinner reminding Louise how much childhood wonder she'd preserved despite early exposure to adult struggles. Other attendees were property managers and senior staff with spouses or partners, their easy conversation suggesting comfort in environments where Louise still felt like she was performing belonging rather than actually experiencing it. Constantino greeted each arrival personally, the host role transforming his usual dangerous intensity into something more approachable, though no less commanding. When he reached Louise and Sky, his attention focused completely on them in a way that made the crowded restaurant feel suddenly intimate, despite the ambient noise and other people. He'd reserved seats directly across from his own position, placement that suggested intention rather than random arrangement, that communicated to everyone present that Louise occupied special status regardless of her official position in the company hierarchy. Skye charmed everyone within conversational range with her unself-conscious intelligence and enthusiasm, asking questions about their work, and genuinely listening to answers with focus that adults found both surprising and delightful. Louise watched her daughter navigate social situations that would have intimidated many adults, and felt pride mixed with concern, because Skye's adaptability came partly from skills developed during their struggling years, when reading situations and adjusting behavior meant safety. The resilience was valuable, but its source was trauma Louise wished her daughter had never needed to develop. The meal progressed through multiple courses Louise couldn't have named, food presented like art, and tasting like something she'd never imagined could come from combining basic ingredients. Constantino explained dishes when he noticed her uncertainty about unfamiliar items, his instruction casual rather than condescending, sharing knowledge without making her ignorance feel shameful. The small kindness shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but Louise had spent too many years being made to feel stupid by people whose only advantage was having been born into circumstances that provided education and cultural exposure she'd been denied. Conversation flowed around topics both professional and personal, the boundaries between work and life blurring in ways that made Louise uncomfortable, because she'd always tried to keep strict separation. But watching her colleagues share stories about their families and weekend plans, she realized her isolation was self-imposed defense mechanism rather than necessary protection. These people weren't trying to expose her inadequacy or judge her past. They were just making normal human connection that work environments fostered when fear didn't prevent participation. Constantino's eyes met hers across the table multiple times throughout the evening, moments of connection that felt weighted with meaning Louise couldn't quite interpret but recognized as significant. His attention wasn't obvious enough to make others notice, but consistent enough that she couldn't dismiss it as imagination or misinterpretation. Something was shifting between them, the professional distance that had characterized their interaction for 3 months, eroding into something that felt both inevitable and terrifying, in ways Louise couldn't articulate even to herself. Skye fell asleep on the car ride home in the back seat of the sedan Constantino had insisted on providing, because taking subway at night was unnecessary when he had drivers available. Louise sat in front next to Marcus, watching city lights blur past window, while Constantino's car followed at discreet distance, the protection implicit rather than stated. She felt cocooned in safety that came from his decision to value them, and the feeling was seductive in ways that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with never having felt protected before in her adult life. The conversation in the car was minimal, Marcus being professional enough not to intrude on her thoughts while she processed the evening's implications. But as they pulled up to her building, he spoke quietly about how rarely Constantino showed genuine interest in people outside his immediate family, how the dinner had been orchestrated specifically to include Louise and Skye, rather than being business function she'd been added to. The information felt like warning and encouragement simultaneously, acknowledgement that she'd been seen entering territory that carried both privilege and risk. Carrying sleeping Skye upstairs, Louise acknowledged that her feelings toward Constantino had evolved beyond gratitude or fear into something that resembled the beginning of trust, despite all rational objections her mind continued producing. He'd proven consistent in his care for them, had never demanded anything beyond professional competence, had respected boundaries even while making clear his interest in something more than employee-employer relationship. The courtship, if that's what this was, happened in silence and gesture, and the language of careful attention, sophisticated and patient, in ways Louise hadn't experienced even when she'd briefly believed in fairy tale romance during her college years. The question she couldn't answer was whether accepting his interest would be wisdom or stupidity, whether trusting someone whose business involved violence could ever end in anything except heartbreak or worse. But lying awake after putting Skye to bed, Louise admitted that the choice might already be made, that somewhere between the museum and now she'd crossed line from resistance to acceptance of whatever this strange connection was becoming. The white roses had been opening statement in conversation. Both of them seemed willing to continue, despite neither knowing where it would ultimately lead. March arrived with the first hints of spring struggling against winter's resistance, temperature fluctuations that promised warmth while delivering final snow that would melt within days instead of lingering for weeks. Louise had been with DiCarlo Property Management for 3 months now, long enough that her presence felt established rather than provisional, though her connection to Constantino remained undefined in ways that created tension she'd learned to live with. Skye had tested into the gifted program, her exceptional intelligence finally receiving resources and attention that circumstances had previously denied, her happiness making every compromise Louise had accepted feel justified. The situation with the Castellano family had reached some kind of resolution that no one discussed with Louise, but that Marcus had mentioned obliquely involved negotiations and concessions, and the kind of violent punctuation that ended disputes in their world. Constantino's security had intensified, then relaxed. The visible protection that had surrounded Louise and Skye during December and January, gradually becoming less obvious, until it seemed almost normal again. Almost, because Louise had learned to spot the signs of surveillance and protection, even when they were designed to be invisible to civilians who didn't know what patterns to recognize. Her relationship with Constantino had developed through accumulation of small moments rather than dramatic gestures, shared glances at company meetings, brief conversations that went slightly beyond professional necessity, his consistent interest in Skye's progress and well-being. They'd never discussed what was happening between them, never acknowledged the shift from gratitude-based obligation toward something that felt increasingly like genuine connection, despite the vast differences in their circumstances and the moral complexity of his business operations. The silence felt safer than words that would require decisions Louise wasn't ready to make, or admissions about feelings she wasn't sure she should acknowledge. The invitation to his private residence came as request rather than command, Maria delivering it with knowing smile that suggested Louise's colleagues had been watching this slow-developing courtship with interest and approval. Dinner with just him and Skye, casual evening meant to celebrate the girls' acceptance into summer enrichment program that Constantino had apparently heard about through channels Louise didn't question. The setting was more intimate than restaurant full of colleagues, more explicitly personal than any interaction they'd shared since the museum night that had begun this entire entanglement. Louise spent embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, her expanded wardrobe still modest compared to wealth she'd be encountering, but adequate for women who'd learned to navigate middle-class professional environments. Skye dressed herself in purple dress she'd chosen during shopping trip the previous weekend, her confidence in social situations continuing to amaze Louise because it seemed innate rather than learned. They took taxi to a dress-in neighborhood where buildings had doormen and private garages, where wealth was old enough not to need displaying itself through obvious markers. Constantino's apartment occupied entire floor of building overlooking Central Park, spaces designed with the kind of understated elegance that signified taste and resources deployed without need for impression. He'd cooked himself rather than having it catered, revelation that surprised Louise until she remembered that he'd grown up in traditional Italian family, where men learned kitchen skills alongside women, despite what stereotypes suggested. The sense of garlic and herbs filled the space, homey and welcoming in ways that contradicted the luxury surrounding them. Skye gravitated immediately toward the windows where Park stretched below like living painting, spring's early green struggling against winter's brown in ways that created unexpected beauty. Constantino joined her there, pointing out landmarks and explaining history with patience that suggested he genuinely enjoyed her endless questions rather than merely tolerating them. Watching them together, Louise felt her careful defenses erode further, because the danger she'd feared from him had never materialized toward them. Only protection and interest, and this gentle attention to her daughter's boundless curiosity. Dinner conversation ranged across topics both serious and playful, Constantino asking Skye about her favorite subjects, and Louise about her thoughts on properties she'd been managing, treating both with equal respect, despite the vast difference in their ages and expertise. He was skilled conversationalist when he chose to be, drawing people out while revealing little about himself, though Louise had learned to read the small tells that indicated actual emotion beneath the controlled presentation. She caught moments when discussing his own childhood or family, when grief flickered across features he otherwise kept carefully neutral. The evening progressed without awkwardness Louise had feared, the three of them finding rhythm that felt almost family-like despite the strangeness of circumstances that had brought them together. Skye fell asleep on the couch after dinner, exhausted from excitement and full stomach, leaving Louise and Constantino alone for first time since the museum night. The silence that felt weighted but not uncomfortable. Acknowledgement that they'd arrived at point where things needed to be said, even though neither seemed quite ready to begin the conversation. Constantino poured wine without asking if she wanted it, an assumption that should have annoyed her. but instead felt like recognition of her autonomy to refuse if she chose. They sat on opposite ends of the sofa where Sky slept between them, physical barrier that made the moment feel safer than direct proximity would have allowed. Louise sipped the wine, something complex that probably cost more than she wanted to know, and waited for him to navigate whatever he'd planned this evening to accomplish beyond simple dinner invitation. "I've been patient," he said finally. Words careful, but weighted with implication, that made Louise's heart accelerate, despite months of sensing this moment's approach. His expression held vulnerability she'd never seen before, the dangerous man showing uncertainty about whether something he wanted might be refused. The power dynamic between them had always been skewed by his wealth and influence, but in this moment, Louise recognized that her answer mattered in ways that transcended those structural imbalances. "You have," Louise agreed, acknowledging the months of careful distance he'd maintained despite clear interest, the respect for boundaries that someone less concerned with her consent wouldn't have bothered extending. She'd been preparing for this conversation without quite admitting it to herself, cataloging her feelings and fears, and the reality that her life had improved dramatically through his intervention, even though accepting that meant complicating her moral certainty about the world and her place in it. Constantino's business was transforming, he explained, legitimate operations expanding while the darker aspects were being gradually transferred to others or dissolved entirely through arrangements that didn't require her understanding. The change had been planned before they met, he insisted, though Louise suspected her daughter's appearance in his life might have accelerated decisions about legacy and what kind of man he wanted to be remembered as being. He was creating distance from violence, not because she demanded it, but because Sky's courage had reminded him that choices made today determine tomorrow's possibilities. The declaration felt both too much and somehow insufficient. This man who terrified hardened criminals trying to explain that he was becoming someone worthy of the trust, Louise was clearly already extending despite her rational mind's objections. She wanted to believe the transformation was real, wanted to trust that people could change fundamental patterns when motivation proved strong enough. But her life had taught her that hoping for rescue usually led to deeper disappointment, that princes and fairy tales existed only in stories that ended before reality's complications emerged. "Sky adores you," Louise said instead of responding to his implicit question, deflection that bought time while her thoughts aligned into coherent position. The truth was that she'd already decided months ago when accepting the job, when moving to his building, when showing up tonight despite knowing where the evening was heading. Fear remained, but it competed now with possibility of happiness she'd stopped believing was available to someone with her history and circumstances. Constantino's smile held relief, and something warmer, acknowledgement that her deflection was still answer enough for now, that they were moving forward, even if neither could articulate exactly where forward led. He'd wait longer if needed, his patience suggested, but he'd also made his interest clear enough that pretending ignorance was an option Louise could maintain indefinitely. The tension that had characterized months of careful distance shifted into something that felt more like anticipation than anxiety, potential energy building toward release neither could quite predict. Sky stirred between them, mumbling something about painted doves before settling deeper into sleep that looked uncomfortable on the sofa despite the expensive upholstery. Constantino lifted her carefully, moving toward the guest bedroom with the ease of someone accustomed to handling children despite not having any of his own. Louise followed, watching him tuck her daughter under covers with tenderness that contradicted every violent reputation that preceded him into rooms, that made her heart ache with wanting to believe this version of him was more authentic than the dangerous one that business required. They stood in the doorway watching Sky sleep for a moment that felt suspended outside normal time, united in protective care for the small girl whose courage had saved one man's life and transformed three people's futures in ways none of them could have predicted. Louise felt Constantino's hand find hers in the darkness, connection that asked permission and offered reassurance simultaneously. She didn't pull away, accepting the touch as commitment to whatever complicated future they were building together, through accumulated choices that had started from violence, but were evolving toward something gentler. The conversation that followed happened in his study over more wine, and the kind of honesty that vulnerability enabled when people decided truth mattered more than self-protection. Louise asked questions she'd been suppressing for months about his business and family, and the changes he claimed were happening, listening to answers that were more forthcoming than she'd expected. Constantino explained the empire he was simultaneously maintaining and transforming, the obligations to people who'd served his family for generations balanced against desire to create something his potential future could participate in. without inheriting dangers that had shaped his own life. He asked about her fears and hopes, and the dreams she'd suppressed during years when survival precluded ambition beyond making it through another week. Louise found herself talking about the college degree she'd never finished, the property management career she'd imagined before pregnancy, and poverty had derailed those plans, the life she might build now that stability had replaced constant crisis. The conversation revealed how much they'd learned about each other through months of careful observation, despite limited direct interaction, how attention and genuine interest had created understanding that transcended the few words they'd actually exchanged. Dawn was approaching when Louise finally called for Carr to take them home, Skye still sleeping in the guest bedroom where Constantino carried her to the vehicle. The goodbye happened at the building's entrance with Marcus discreetly distant, moment of privacy in public space, where Constantino's hand touched her face with tenderness she hadn't expected. No kiss happened because rushing felt wrong given how carefully they'd built toward this point. But the promise of that eventual intimacy hung between them as certainty rather than possibility. The following weeks brought spring in earnest, winter's grip finally releasing into warmth that transformed the city from gray endurance into green possibility. Constantino appeared more frequently in Louise's daily life, lunches that began as work discussions and evolved into personal conversation, evenings at his apartment that became weekly tradition where Skye thrived under attention from man who'd become something between mentor and father figure. The relationship developed its own rhythm, patient and careful and accumulating weight through consistency rather than dramatic gestures that characterized romance in movies, but rarely survived reality's complications. By May, the flowers arrived at Louise's desk weekly, different varieties each time that created ongoing conversation through botanical language she learned to interpret. Her colleagues stopped speculating about secret admirer once Constantino's interest became too obvious to pretend wasn't happening, their acceptance of the relationship validating it in ways that helped Louise reconcile her lingering guilt about compromising principles she'd held when options existed only in theory. The world was more complicated than she'd believed when judging from outside, she'd learned, and survival sometimes required accepting help from sources that idealism would have rejected if idealism could have fed her daughter. Summer brought the enrichment program that challenged Skye intellectually while surrounding her with peers who shared her capabilities, the experience giving her community that Louise's isolation had previously denied them both. Watching her daughter thrive became Louise's evidence that she'd made right choice despite the moral complexity, that Skye's flourishing justified the compromises that had enabled it. Constantino attended the program's final presentation, where Skye explained her project on Renaissance art with enthusiasm that referenced the museum where they'd met, full circle that made three people who'd been strangers 9 months ago into something approaching family. The actual proposal happened in September during walk through Central Park, when leaves were just beginning their autumn transformation. Constantino's question delivered with uncertainty that made powerful man seem almost vulnerable. Louise's yes came without hesitation, because the months had proven his consistency and genuine care, because Skye deserved the stability this relationship offered, because her own heart had learned to trust, despite every reasonable objection her mind had initially raised. The ring was beautiful, but not ostentatious, perfect in its balance between acknowledging his wealth and respecting her discomfort with excessive display. They married quietly in November, small ceremony attended by people who mattered, rather than the society wedding Constantino's position could have demanded, his concession to Louise's preference for privacy and authenticity over performance. Skye served as flower girl with joy that justified every choice Louise had made since that snowy December night, when her daughter's courage had set all of this in motion. The vows they exchanged acknowledged the unconventional beginning and uncertain future, promised patience with each other's complications, and commitment to building something real from circumstances that had started in violence, but were transforming into love through daily choice and accumulated grace. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue creating stories like this one. The journey from that museum night to this moment has been unexpected for all of us, and I'm grateful you've been part of it.